Hello and welcome to the channel. Today is December 29th, and we're about to dive into a detailed analysis of a topic that's making waves across the UK. If you're passionate about in-depth analysis of the big headlines shaping global politics, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to stay up to date with our content. We're going to unravel the stories behind these headlines and explore how they connect to the broader political shifts happening right now. Let's get started. Just a few months ago, the Labour Party was riding high, basking in the glory of a resounding victory. Their success in the July elections seemed to signal a bright future ahead. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who had worked tirelessly to lead his party to this triumph, felt confident that Labour was on the path to sustained success. Yet, as the months passed, the winds of politics began to shift dramatically, and the once optimistic outlook soon became clouded with doubt. It all started with the rising discontent among voters in rural communities. These areas, once seen as a vital stronghold for Labour, were now growing increasingly disillusioned with the party's policies. At a local pub in the West Country, a group of lifelong Labour supporters gathered to discuss the political landscape. Bill, a farmer in his 60s, voiced the concerns of many. "It's all gone pear-shaped, hasn't it? These changes to the inheritance tax rules are the last straw for us. It's like they've forgotten where they came from," Bill said, shaking his head in disbelief. His words echoed the growing frustration that was spreading throughout rural communities across the country. His friend, Peter, who had worked in local government for decades, nodded in agreement. "I can't believe it, Bill. We've always backed Labour, but now? It feels like they've turned their backs on us. The new rules are going to hit the farmers hard, and they haven't done anything to fix it. If anything, they've made it worse." Bill sighed, taking a slow sip of his pint before continuing. "It's not just the tax changes. Labour promised us fair treatment, promised us a government that would listen to the people. But when it came to the Waspi women, they just shrugged. No compensation, no apology, just empty words. How can they expect us to keep voting for them?" Peter's expression darkened. "You're right. Those women worked all their lives and were robbed of their pensions. You'd think Labour would stand up for them, but instead, they're sticking their heads in the sand. That's not the party we used to know. It's all about the big cities now, and they've forgotten about the rest of us." As the conversation continued, the dissatisfaction in the air was palpable. Across the pub, more patrons joined in the discussion, each adding their voice to the growing chorus of disappointment. The anger wasn't just about the policies, it was about a sense of betrayal. These were the people who had long trusted Labour to fight for them, but now, it seemed, that trust was being shattered. Meanwhile, in Westminster, the atmosphere was just as tense. Inside the House of Commons, Prime Minister Keir Starmer sat with a furrowed brow, listening to his aides present the latest poll numbers. The numbers were dire. According to a new poll, if an election were held today, Labour would lose nearly 200 seats, an unprecedented reversal of fortune for the party. Starmer's political strategist, Emma, looked at the figures with concern. "Keir, this is serious. The polling shows that Labour is losing ground across the board. We're losing seats to the Conservatives, to Reform UK, and even to the SNP. If we don't turn this around, we'll be looking at a hung parliament, or worse." Keir Starmer, trying to mask his concern, leaned back in his chair. "I knew we were facing challenges, but I didn't think it would come to this. What happened? Just a few months ago, we were riding high after our victory." Emma tapped her tablet, bringing up the breakdown of voter sentiment. "It's a combination of factors, Keir. Rural voters, the working class, they feel betrayed. The changes to inheritance tax have hit the farmers particularly hard. And the Waspi women, they're furious. They feel like they've been abandoned by their own party." Starmer sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't expect things to turn this quickly. But we can't ignore it. We need to address these issues head-on." An interesting development in this political shift is the meteoric rise of Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage. This party has surged from just 5 seats in July to a projected 72 seats. Reform UK has tapped into the frustration of many former Labour voters, who now feel abandoned by the government's lack of action and unclear messaging. This unexpected surge has highlighted how fragmented British politics has become, leaving the dominance of the traditional parties in doubt. It was a chilly evening in Birmingham when the news of Reform UK's rise became impossible to ignore. In a crowded pub, a group of lifelong Labour supporters gathered around a table, their conversation full of tension as they discussed the latest developments in British politics. One of them, Steve, a former Labour supporter, looked down at his pint, a frown etched on his face. "Blimey, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm starting to think Reform UK might actually be onto something," Steve muttered, shaking his head. "I mean, Farage has always been a bit of a Marmite figure, but there's something about this party that's getting under my skin. They're talking to people like us, not the political elites." His friend Dave, sitting across the table, snorted. "You're joking, right? Farage? That bloke's got a reputation for stirring up trouble. But, you're right, there's something going on. Labour's lost the plot, mate. They've ignored us for far too long. Reform UK's making all the right noises, though, isn't it?" Steve nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, I mean, Labour used to be the party for the working class, but look at them now. They're off on some weird tangent, worrying about things that don't matter to people like us. Farage and Reform UK are saying what we're all thinking. They've got the right message for once." At that moment, another mate, Paul, who had been listening intently, chimed in. "You know what's mad? Reform UK's gone from practically nothing to a real threat. They're talking about 72 seats in Parliament, up from just 5 in July. That's unheard of, especially with someone like Farage at the helm." The conversation in the pub mirrored what was happening across the country. In just a few short months, Reform UK had surged in popularity, tapping into a deep well of frustration among voters who felt abandoned by the major political parties. Farage, with his characteristic bravado and no-nonsense approach, had become the voice of a new wave of disillusioned voters. His ability to connect with the common man, to rail against what he saw as the entrenched elite, had struck a chord with a wide swath of the electorate. It was an electoral revolt, and it was gaining momentum. Farage's speeches, often delivered with the fiery rhetoric that had made him a household name, were now resonating with voters who had previously supported Labour but had grown disillusioned with the party's lack of action. In his rallies, Farage spoke directly to the people's grievances, their frustration with politicians who made grand promises but failed to deliver. This shift in the political landscape not only impacts the Labour Party but also highlights the fragility of the traditional two-party system. In the current projections, no party seems likely to secure a majority, suggesting the possibility of a hung parliament or even an era of coalition politics. The poll results show that both the Conservatives and Labour face significant hurdles in forming a majority government. Meanwhile, smaller parties such as the SNP and Liberal Democrats continue to challenge the established order. In a quiet corner of London, 3 longtime friends, Sophie, George, and Harry, sat in a cafe, each absorbed in the latest news about the political shift. They had been following the poll results with increasing concern, as the projections painted a picture of a fractured and uncertain future for British politics. "I can't believe what I'm seeing, guys," Sophie said, shaking her head. "They're saying there's no clear winner now. No one can form a majority. It's going to be a hung parliament, isn't it? Labour and the Tories are both losing ground, and smaller parties are picking up steam." George, who had been quietly reading the newspaper, looked up with a frown. "You're right. If the election were held today, we could be looking at a real mess. Labour's falling apart, and while the Tories are gaining a few seats, they're still miles from a majority. It's all up in the air." Harry, always the optimist of the group, offered a different perspective. "Well, maybe it's time for a change. If it's not just Labour or the Conservatives, maybe this is a good thing. We might finally see some real coalition politics. Let's face it, nothing's been getting done under the two-party system for years." Sophie looked skeptical. "You might be right, Harry, but look at the mess in Parliament right now. It's like everyone's just fighting for a piece of the pie, and no one wants to work together. Can we really rely on coalition politics to make anything happen?" George sighed. "That's the problem. In theory, coalition politics sounds great, but the reality is it's often messy. If we have a situation where no one can get a majority, we might end up with a government that can't agree on anything. It's going to be a nightmare trying to pass any meaningful legislation. As Labour faces growing pressure to correct its course and reconnect with its voters, British politics enters uncharted territory. Without a clear change and a compelling message, Labour risks further alienating its supporters. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party, although gaining ground, also faces challenges in securing a stable majority. In conclusion, the political future of the UK remains uncertain, with a fragmented landscape and the potential for a new era of coalition politics that could reshape how the country is governed. Labour's base, once strong and steadfast, was now splintering, and the failure to address key issues like the backlash over rural taxes and the lack of support for the Waspi women left many voters wondering if the party was still capable of delivering on its promises. Starmer's leadership was now under intense scrutiny, and the party's future seemed uncertain. If they didn't find a way to regain voter trust soon, they risked losing even more ground. Meanwhile, the Tories, though regaining a bit of traction, still faced an uphill battle to secure the majority they once took for granted. Coalition politics, once a last resort measure, seemed more and more likely, with smaller parties like Reform UK, the SNP, and the Lib Dems playing an increasingly crucial role. With the future of British politics in flux, one thing was clear: the days of a dominant two-party system were over. The UK was heading into uncharted waters, and only time would tell how this new era of political fragmentation would unfold. That's all for today, folks. What do you think about the topics we've discussed in today's video? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content. See you in the next one.